It's my pleasure to welcome you to Roosevelt University and to this collaboration with the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy. Today we're going to hear the very important discussion entitled The Illinois Fiscal Crisis, Current Facts and the Way Forward, brought to you again by the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy and delivered by Roosevelt's Arthur Rubloff Endowed Professor of Public Policy, Ralph Martire. The Stevenson Center mission of enhancing the global understanding and practice of democracy in order to address challenges to democratic systems of government reflects Roosevelt's own history and mission. The university was founded in 1945. We're celebrating our 75th anniversary this year. To protest discriminatory racial and religious college admission quotas. And we remain dedicated to providing access to higher education for all qualified students. In keeping with our heritage, Roosevelt is constantly renewing our commitment to understand our national ethos of democracy and equality. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Ralph Martire. Professor Martire joined the Roosevelt faculty in August 2018, filling the Arthur Rubloff Professorship in Public Policy that was left vacant by the death of Paul Green. Professor Martire also serves as the executive director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. The center is a bipartisan, nonprofit think tank that has actually had a great deal of influence on the politicians, the legislators in Illinois. They examine state, federal, and local workforce, education, fiscal, and budget policies to ensure that they are fair and just and promote opportunity for all. Professor Martire has received numerous awards for his work on education and public policy reform, including the Champion of Freedom Award presented by the Rainbow Push Coalition and the Ben C. Hubbard Leadership Award awarded by Illinois State University to individuals who have greatly benefited education in Illinois. Notably, Professor Martire also received the Adlai Stevenson Award for Public Service presented by the American Society for Public Administration for outstanding contributions to government and public administration. Ralph has been featured as a tax policy expert for numerous television and radio news programs such as WTTW, WGN, and NPR. He serves as a regular columnist for the State Journal Register and the Daily Herald on issues involving government accountability, tax, fiscal, and budget policies. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Martire.
Hello, good afternoon. So who here has gone to the Stevenson Center Family Home and Museum? Anyone visit it? Make sure you do. It's a beautiful place. It's a wonderful museum, and you'll be following in the footsteps of Eleanor Roosevelt, who stayed at that house, I believe. And does she have a room named after her there? Is that true? But anyway, you'll be following in the footsteps of the great Eleanor Roosevelt, who this wonderful university is named after. We need to go back here. I jumped way ahead when I got up here. So, I am going to talk about the hot issue in Illinois today. And the hot issue is, of course, what Governor Pritzker calls the fair tax. It's really just a progressive rate income tax proposal. But you can't get into the details of something like that without understanding context. Solving problems requires really identifying what caused those problems in the first place. And when it comes to fiscal policy, tax policy in Illinois, we really have a lot of rhetoric out there in the public and in the media that has nothing to do with the problems that really we confront in the state of Illinois. This picture is the answer to pretty much any question you may ever have about fiscal problems in Illinois. Why are your property taxes high? Because of that. Why have we underfunded our pensions? Because of that. Why do we need to raise new net tax revenue? It's because of that. What's that? It's a model of a structural deficit. It projects whether the state's current revenue will maintain our current expenditures on services, just adjusting for changes in inflation and population, assuming a normal economy, and assuming no changes in law. It also assumes you start with a balanced budget, which you will quickly see in a slide or two. We are not starting with a balanced budget. But if we were, that yellow line shows you the cost of maintaining current services into the future, and it shows you the cost of paying off our debt. The red line shows you what our revenue will generate. The gap between revenue growth and service cost growth is a structural deficit. Now, this is the only piece of complex modeling I'm going to present during today's talk. And the reason for that is simple. Who does stats here? Anybody do a lot of stats work? Okay, so you know, when you have a model, you could jury rig your assumptions to make your model dance to any tune you want it to. So we try not to do that at the CTBA. So this has been independently peer reviewed by 4 different PhD economists, including the head of state and local tax at the GAO in Washington, DC. We've been using it at the CTBA since about 04, 05, and it has accurately predicted the growth of the state's deficit within 1 percentage point, except those years they changed law. I can't predict a change in law. So it's a pretty solid model. We have had a structural deficit in Illinois for generations. So for generations, the state hasn't had adequate revenue growth to continue providing the same level of services from one year into the next. Now, the only sustainable ways to actually solve a structural deficit are raise taxes so that you have adequate revenue to support your spending levels. I don't know if you know that, but tax increases tend to be politically difficult to accomplish. Tax actually is one of 2 3-letter words ending in X in the English language that gets everyone all excited. You could cut your expenditures right down to your revenue line, but as you're going to see in a slide, that's going to be politically unpopular too. So there's other things you can do as a politician to avoid dealing with a structural deficit. 2 come to mind. Number 1, push the primary responsibility for paying for a major state service away from the state and down to local governments. That's why your property taxes are high. The state did this with education funding. We are the most reliant state in all of America on local property taxes to fund K-12 education, and the least reliant state in all of America on state-based tax revenue. The reason? Structural deficit. State pushing this responsibility down. Second thing they figured out they could do is, if we find some long-term obligation that really isn't going to create problems until down the road, i.e. when I am out of office, then let's underfund it, write an IOU, and just use the money that should have gone there to cover service costs here. What do you think they picked to do this with? The pensions. So we have a hugely unfunded pension system, not because the costs of the pensions are outrageous or the benefits are outrageous or anything like that. It's because for decades we didn't put into them what we should have. We wrote an IOU, and then we created a repayment plan that was so crazy backloaded, no tax policy could actually accommodate it, and welcome to crazy backloaded period. We are in the backloading. So here it is. There's your answer to all those key questions. So where actually are we at the state right now with our budget? And the answer is pretty simple. This is the 2020 budget that passed, the general fund budget. We are living in the 2020 fiscal year. It'll end this June. You see that top line, our total expenditures this year on all things is going to be $40 billion. $40 billion. We at the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability break those expenditures down into 2 component parts. Hard costs, which are basically things the state has to pay either by law or by contract, and then more discretionary spending where they get some votes. So if you look at the hard cost line, $13 billion of that $40 billion is spent, nobody votes. Debt service owed to bondholders, number one. The pension contribution is actually the subject of a continuing appropriation in a statute, so every year there's an identified dollar amount now that the state has to fund. Then there's some other smaller statutory transfers out that are about $449 million or so. A little bit goes to the road fund, a little bit goes to Medicaid trust funds, et cetera. And then health insurance for state workers. That's going to be a $2 billion liability this year. So there you go, that money is spent. And then you get down to the general fund appropriations for services. Notice that 97% of what the state of Illinois spends on services really only goes to four things: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. That's it. 97 cents of every dollar. Now, education has three component parts, right? Early childhood, K-12, and higher ed, but it's all education on a continuum. So if you have a structural deficit, cutting the heck out of education, health, social services, and public safety is not a prescription for getting reelected. I'm telling you, the way we spend our money and having a political process really encouraged these really irresponsible fiscal decisions to push the responsibility down for funding schools to the local level and to borrow against the pensions. It also, I think, hopefully destroys some of the rhetoric you hear. Like, well, we could do a better job with our budget if we just had better spending priorities. Okay, which one of education, healthcare, social services, and public safety do you want to get rid of to add in your new or better spending priority? Yeah, I didn't think so. How about other? That's 3% of the appropriations for services. It's literally everything else state government does. So it's central management services, it's economic development, it's taking care of the public parks, it's environmental protection. I'm assuming we need to do some of that stuff. Buried in other is also what I think we should have a line item for in Illinois. We don't, but we should. Waste, fraud, and abuse, right? Don't you think if we just had a line item and said, this year, you guys get to waste, fraud, and abuse, pick a number, and we could all kumbaya out of there. But interestingly, it's buried, patronage, jobs, all those other things, in this other category, which is 3% of the state budget on services. And some of those expenditures are needed. So if we could magically at the state level eliminate all waste, fraud, and abuse, anybody here run a business? Business person? Yes, no? All right. I was a business lawyer for years before I took this job at the CTBA, and I'm thrilled to have this job at Roosevelt University, the greatest university on the planet, by the way. Greatest. I was a business lawyer, and I did mergers and acquisitions, structured finance, intellectual property. I was a partner. And I represented not little companies. I represented the big guy, Fortune 5 banks, those kinds of things. I didn't have one client that didn't have waste, fraud, and abuse as a problem in their system. Not a one. You have it in the private sector, you have it in the public sector. Should you be vigilant to ferret it out and eliminate it? Let me think about it. Yes, you should. But should you let something like that drive the bus or prevent you from pushing for needed tax reforms that are essential to funding these core services? No, you shouldn't. And in fact, a lot of the people who push on you the waste, fraud, and abuse argument are the politicians that don't want to work on tax policy because it's hard for them. They're trying to get you to let them off the hook from making tough decisions. So, where are we? Now remember that structural deficit model started with the assumption we have a balanced budget in the state of Illinois. We, in fact, do not. If you go to the far left-hand column here, you see that we have projected for fiscal year 2020 $40 billion in revenue. Then the next line over is what we're going to spend it on. So hard costs, that's the things we have to pay by law, $13 billion. Just take that off the top. So that leaves $27 billion in revenue for current services. Okay, that sounds good. $27 billion in revenue for services, but what's not in the state budget? $7.7 billion accumulated deficit carry forward from the prior year, fiscal year 2019. You should hear when I say accumulated carry forward deficit as unpaid bills. And so by law, the state has to pay off any bills remaining from a prior fiscal year before the end of the next fiscal year, which means your accumulated deficit becomes a charge on your current revenue. So let's take that out. That leaves $19 billion in revenue. They are going to spend $27 billion in services, so the deficit remains at about $7.5 billion. Or roughly 28% of what the state of Illinois is spending on education, health, social services, and public safety is deficit spending. We do not have the revenue to cover. Now, I want to give you a little more context. Our state is a fairly large state, both economically and from a population standpoint. So we have the 5th largest economy, we have the 6th largest population of any state. Our state economy is over $888 billion. That's our state GDP. The total tax increases we would need to solve all our fiscal problems sustainably going forward would be in the, let's call it $5 to $6 billion range, roughly, or less than 1% of our economic activity. We are letting a tax increase of less than 1% of our economic activity get in the way of solving all these long-term problems. And that's why putting things in context tends to matter. So here we are, that's not sustainable. Did spending on services drive this problem? No. These are the state's own numbers. This is our spending on that second part of the budget. This is all our service expenditures from 2009 to the current budget year 2020. In 2009, we spent $27.5 billion on education, health, social services, public safety, and other. This year, we're spending 27.1, 400 million less in nominal dollars than a decade ago at the end of the Great Recession. Where's this crazy ramp up in spending that's driving our deficit? You know, let's go back a little further. These are the kind of graphics we love at the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability because they are turgid and loaded with data. Well, what fun, right? Next show of hands, who woke up this morning and said, I just want to see huge graphics loaded with data and talk about tax policy through lunch. Everybody woke up that way. I know I did. So be happy you're not me. Every day, be happy you're not me. The far left-hand column shows you the fiscal year 2000 budget, the actual expenditure amount for each of these core services. So we broke education down by its component parts, but you have education, healthcare, social services, public safety. The next column over, we simply adjusted that expenditure for inflation into today's dollars. So if you wanted to have the same level of expenditure that you had in 2000 today on K-12 education, you'd have to be spending $8.2 billion. That is in fact staying equal in real terms. It's an apples to apples comparison. The third column is what the budget actually contains. And then the fourth column is the difference. And what you will see, go to the very bottom line, is today, in the year 2020, we are spending 11% less on education, health, social services, and public safety collectively than we did in the year 2000 in real inflation-adjusted dollars. 11% less. Now, there are a couple of beacons of good news in here, so I'll highlight those. K-12 education is up by almost 8% in real terms, or less than 1/4 point per year. Now, if I was doing this presentation last year, that would still be a negative number. The only reason it is up is we have this new school funding formula called the evidence-based formula that literally requires the state of Illinois to put more money into education than it did the prior year, anywhere from 350 million more every year. That's the only reason we are up. Early childhood, good news. Governor Pritzker made a point of our early childhood investments, and we do sort of lead the nation here. This is one of the areas where Illinois is ahead of some other states, and that's investing in early childhood. That's up by 81%, or from what should, if we were just going to stay equal, a $299 million investment to $544 million investment. Sounds great. Here's the bad news. The actual demand for early childhood services in Illinois approaches $3 billion. So while it's a good thing that we've increased this investment, that's definitely a positive, we ain't coming anywhere near meeting need at the current moment. And then everything else is cut. And let's highlight higher education there. That's like Ignore the inflation-adjusted line for higher ed. In the year 2000, higher education got a $2.1 billion appropriation from the state of Illinois. This year, it's getting less in nominal dollars, $1.9 billion. If you adjusted for inflation, it's 48% less. What has this meant? Well, I'll give you some context for that because, you know, failure to invest in core services does have consequences. So we actually started cutting higher ed expenditures significantly in the 2003-2004 range under then Governor Rod Blagojevich because, quite frankly, if it could be done wrong, Rod sort of sought it out and did it. So just before we started cutting in 2003, state appropriations for higher ed covered over 70% of the cost of a student attending a public institution of higher learning in our state, a public university. Tuition and fees covered in the 20s. Those numbers have now flipped. And tuition and fees are covering over 70%, and state appropriations in the 20s. That's the consequence of long-term disinvestment in a core service. And if you don't think that disinvestment hasn't had a disproportionate impact along income and racial lines, you are fooling yourself. And if you want more detailed information on how, in fact, it has had this disparate impact along racial and income lines, you could go to the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability's website and pull out our report on higher education that puts all this in context. So we do have more fiscal pressure coming from the EBF on the spending side. The state of Illinois, like I said, under this law, the evidence-based funding formula, is supposed to be putting anywhere from $300 to $350 million more into K-12 funding every single year than the prior year, real growth. There's a second funding requirement in that legislation, though, and the second funding requirement was within 10 years of it being implemented, the evidence-based funding formula, it had to be fully funded. Well, it was implemented in fiscal year 2018, so that means by 2028, it's supposed to be fully funded. At the current rate, it will take into the year 2047 to fully fund this bill. See, we're $7 billion short, according to what the evidence indicates, in our K-12 funding system today. And on an inflation-adjusted basis, to catch up with that $7 billion at $300 to $350 million a year, it'll take 47 years. We're going to lose generations of children to an underfunded educational system in the 5th richest state in the richest nation in the world. One more thing about our state economy. If we were an independent country, that would be the 20th largest economy in the world. And yet, we can't do a tax increase of less than 1% of that economic activity to fund these priorities? You kidding me? So those are some issues that we have on the spending side, and I just thought I'd give you a graphic on this really strong push by the state of Illinois down to the local level of the responsibility for funding local public education. So the left-hand bars show you the percentage in an average state of education funding covered by local property taxes, which as you can see is just under 45%, versus state-based revenue, which is about 47%. We go to the right-hand column, that's Illinois. 67% of the cost of public education is covered by local property taxes, while just about 25%, under 25%, is covered by state-based revenue. So we rank 50th in the nation in the portion of K-12 we pay for at the state level, and #1 in reliance on property taxes. So you want property taxes to come down? I think they should come down. If you do a tax policy analysis of Illinois, overall, we are a relatively low tax state when you look at total state and local tax burden as a percentage of income to compare apples to apples, because different states have different taxes, different fees. We rank about 33rd. Property taxes, we always rank, when you isolate that, in the top 3. We way over-rely on this local source. Now, that's not just bad fiscal policy. Think about what it does from an education policy standpoint. It literally ties the quality of public education a student is going to get to the property wealth of the community in which the student lives. And if you don't believe that, you should visit my schools in my home district in River Forest, where I was president of the school board for 5 years and on the school board for 8. We have 3 schools, 2 of which are National Blue Ribbon. The third isn't only because we have such a significant special needs population in that school that it's not going to satisfy the testing criteria. But we have that significant special needs population because people move into River Forest because we will provide their student with whatever they need. An example, my last year as president of that district, which was in fact 2018, we spent over $1 million to provide transportation services to 5 students who were severely disabled and had special transportation needs. $1 million for 5 kids. Now you step outside of River Forest 1 foot, you're in Austin, Maywood, and Bellwood. You think their schools look like our schools? No. And that's because of this tie to property taxes. It's outrageous, and we have the wealth, we have the capacity in Illinois to do better. But it's also not good from a taxing people standpoint. So I just thought I'd throw this up here because it's interesting information. We've adjusted for inflation. And since 1990, that red bar shows you in real terms, property taxes have grown in Illinois by almost 70%. During that same period of time, median income has grown by just over 11. You can't have a tax burden that's outstripping growth in income in your state by 7 times as one of your key funding elements for things like schools. It's an unfair way to tax people. It's a lousy way to tax businesses because property taxes are a fixed cost. They got to pay that, right? They want to rent that facility. They want to be in that facility. I pay the property tax. So this over-reliance on property taxes caused by the state structural deficit has to be addressed sustainably. And the only way to address it sustainably is to get more revenue into the state system so that it can adequately do its job of funding education, health, social services, and public safety. That's what's got to happen. All right, what has grown in Illinois on the cost side? And the answer is debt service. So this shows you hard cost growth over time. I'm going to just highlight that, what was it, like a gray-blue bar at the top? That's the growth in the pension payment. But I say it's mostly debt only because that's the truth. So in fiscal year 2020, the pension payment is $8.3 billion, and of that amount, about 2.7 to 3 is the actual normal cost of funding benefits. The rest is debt service. In fact, this is what the debt service plan looks like for our pension systems, to pay back what was borrowed. You add the 2 borrowers together, there's your total cost over time. We broke the payments down into their component elements, normal cost and debt payment, just to make it very clear what the driver of the problem is here. Normal cost, that pink bar at the bottom that's declining, that's the actual cost of funding benefits for current workers that are in the system. The blue bar, that's the brilliant plan for repaying the pensions, the debt that was owed them that was passed back in 1995. Which do you think is causing the pressure? Yet out of Springfield, everything they do is focus on cutting benefits for teachers and healthcare workers and social workers. Cutting benefits for frontline workers isn't going to solve this problem. Fixing that debt load has to be part of your answer. In fact, I feel really good about my ability to design tax policy. You teach a master's course here at Roosevelt, you should all take it. It's loads of fun. I can't design a tax system where the revenue grows like that. I cannot do it. There's no natural way to tax the modern economy to match this growth. So you either have to raise taxes almost every single year, boy, that's politically viable, or eviscerate your expenditures on education, health, social services, and public safety. And so you've seen what's been going on at times, right, here in Illinois. We've been disinvesting in services as sort of a slow drip over time because of our failure to address taxes and because of this backloaded repayment plan. So here's the solution. I'm not going to get into it too much. So the red line, that's the current pension ramp. Those bars underneath it are the way we would re-amortize the debt, the new payment plan. And what you see is a big difference. So while the pension ramp promises to get these pension systems 90% funded, meaning they'll have 90% of the assets they should have by the year 2045, that would be an improvement since they only have 39% of the assets they need today. We say we can't afford to do that. That wastes too much money on debt service. So we say, let's get 72% funded. You're healthy at 80, according to the Congressional Budget Office. A public pension system never needs 100% of the assets because you don't have everyone retire on the same day. Let's get close to 80% funded and save taxpayers $45 billion. That's what this refinancing plan does. Now, if you want to be mad, I'd like you to be mad. If they'd have passed this refinancing plan 2 years ago, we would have saved taxpayers $67 billion. The magic of compounding interest. You wait, the problem gets worse. When we first proposed this in like 05, 06, Kathy, maybe you remember, I don't remember when we first proposed it, but it was around then. Kathy's on my board of directors. She's a great American. Clap for Kathy, she's a wonderful person. When we first proposed this back in like 05, 06, total taxpayer cost would have been about $4 billion. Down here. Now total taxpayer cost is going to be about 11 per year. The magic of compounding interest. They need to make this part of the solution in addition to the fair tax, by the way. I don't know anyone who's out there campaigning for the fair tax that claims it solves all our problems, but if they are, they're misleading you. It does not. It's a really important step forward. We have to do it, but we also have to do some other things. This is one of the other things that we absolutely have to do. So to deal with a structural deficit, then you do need to raise taxes. There's my horrified taxpayer looking at me like, what? I actually get that look more than you would think, really. But it's true. So if you're going to raise taxes, then you need to think about some of the challenges you confront with tax policy. And here's the biggest challenge. Wherever your needs are greatest, your resources are least. Period. So that means tax policy has to be redistributive to work. You have to raise from people and areas of wealth and spend in areas of need. That is not communism. That is math. Now, since I know you are all meat-eating capitalists, I know I am, I thought we should look for some guidance on how to design a tax system in a society that's capitalist that could actually raise revenue the right way and distribute it the right way. So I looked to Adam Smith. So now you guys got to get involved. Do you all know who Adam Smith is? Your hands? Yes, he invented capitalism, right? Wrote The Wealth of Nations, published in what year? Bonus question. Who said that? 1776? You are correct. America and capitalism born together. Yes, meant to be. All right, so I don't like to read from my PowerPoints, but I am going to read this because it's that important. So, according to Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, the subjects of every state ought to contribute toward the support of the government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities, that is, in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state. As Henry Home Keynes has written, a goal of taxation should be to remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. Not Marx, Adam flippin' Smith. Now, why did Adam Smith come up with this theory of taxation for a capitalist economy? And the answer is bargaining power. He said, in a capitalist economy, the owners of capital, the people with wealth at the top of the ladder, have so much bargaining power advantage over a mere laborer that they will always take a portion of the value a laborer contributes to the economy away from the laborer and put it in their own pocket through the negotiation process and setting wages, etc. In other words, they're going to get a disproportionate share of income growth over time, and that's because of bargaining power. So because the system's going to work like that, the people at the top of the income ladder ought to have the greatest tax burdens as a share of their income to fund the government that in turn supports the economy that gives them a disproportionate share of income growth over time. We could test Adam Smith's theory with numbers. This is the research done by Piketty and Sayers. It just looks at what people reported to the Internal Revenue Service on their tax returns as their income. Adjusting for inflation from 1947 to 1979, the wealthiest 10% in America got 34% of all the growth in income, meaning the bottom 90% got 66%. Now, these were relatively good times. I mean, a rising tide was lifting all boats. And in real terms, and it didn't matter how low you cut the income data, every cohort of income earner was seeing real inflation-adjusted growth in income every single year. So real improvement in purchasing power, real improvement in standard of living. Things have changed. So from 1979 to 2015, the last year they studied, the wealthiest 10% got 108% of all the growth in income in America. If you hate math, I will point out 100% is all of it. So if more than all the growth in income went to the wealthiest 10%, that means literally 90% of the labor market was earning less on an inflation-adjusted basis at the end of the sequence than at the beginning. So I think Adam would have certainly predicted the first chart. He would not have predicted the second. You really need a tax that could respond to this reality. There is only one tax that can be designed to comport with ability to pay, and that is the income tax. No other tax cares about your ability to pay it. None. Excise tax is like a per unit charge for gasoline or cigarettes or alcohol, whatever. It's the same dollar amount per unit for someone working at McDonald's as it is for a millionaire. Sales tax, you both buy the same plastic comb in a store, same sales tax on that comb for someone working at McDonald's as a millionaire. Income tax, you could actually design that to track ability to pay by setting lower rates at lower levels of income and higher rates at higher levels of income. What a thought. But it's literally the only tax that can be used to do that. No other tax can be designed in such a way, which is why from a tax policy standpoint, it is crucial to have a progressive rate income tax in your tax system. It does some things no other tax can do, and when you're putting together tax policy, what you're doing is designing a system to work in good and bad economic times along different principles. This is the tax that responds to how income gets distributed in the economy, and this is the tax that creates some fairness based on different levels of income. It's the tax you use for that. So what's going on in Illinois? The same stuff that's going on in the nation. We looked at the same period that Piketty and Sayers did and looked at Illinois data, and lo and behold, the wealthiest 10% in our state over the same period got 108% of all the growth in income, bottom 90% seen income decline. This chart, I think, really highlights it. We tracked the growth in income for the wealthiest 1% in Illinois, that's the red bar, versus the bottom 99%. So the wealthiest 1% in our state have seen their incomes grow by 177% after inflation over this period. The bottom 99%, just 7. All right, come on. You need a tax that could respond to this reality. One more thing about it. So, I mean, there's a lot of talk about if you do go to a progressive rate tax, you're going to scare millionaires out of your state and all this other stuff, and that's, the technical term on that is malarkey, but there's really never been a peer-reviewed study that finds any statistically meaningful correlation between tax policy and migration. Do some people leave a state because of taxes? Of course, right? But I mean, is there a statistically meaningful correlation? No. But people at the top can afford it in more ways than one. It's not just that their incomes are growing. Their incomes have been growing at a disproportionate rate for decades, which means their share of wealth is significantly higher than the rest of the nation. So this is just US Census data. Go ahead, run these numbers at home. The wealthiest 10%, my far right column there, holds 77% of America's wealth. and the wealthiest 3% own over half of it. So, you know, shifting some tax burden to these folks is hurting no one, not going to hurt anyone. So Illinois, of course, ignores all that, and we focus our tax burden on the bottom. So the bottom 20, 40, 60, 80% in Illinois all pay a greater percentage of their income in taxes than do the wealthiest 1%. And the reason for this is our income tax. And in a perfect world, right, you'd have an income tax that was progressive with these lower rates on lower levels of income and higher rates on higher levels of income. You and me don't live in a perfect world. We live in Illinois. And so, yeah, right, why? So we live in Illinois, and our state constitution requires one flat rate. And so that has created some problems that we have to fix. Now, the good news is this November, you guys are going to have the opportunity to vote on a constitutional amendment that would permit a graduated rate structure. And by the way, that's all that will happen constitutionally. It becomes permissive. The actual rate structure is a creature of legislation. This legislation, though, has passed. And if the constitutional amendment does get ratified, this rate structure automatically becomes law January 1, 2021. So what's it do? It literally cuts taxes for 97% of the taxpayers in Illinois. If you go to that middle-ish bar at the $100,000 of taxable income range, and by the way, this is taxable income, you see a 4.95% income tax rate. That is our current income tax rate. And the far left column is if you're single, and in the middle column, second column rather, you're married filing jointly, and that's your taxable income. So you can see on your taxable income below that, you're going to be paying a lesser rate. So on your taxable income between $0 and $10,000, you pay a rate of 4.75%. Then between 10 and 100,000, you pay a rate of 4.9, and then you pay the current flat rate of 4.95% on that portion of your income between 100 and 250. So note that that's how a marginal rate structure works. Everybody gets the benefit of the lower rates at the lower levels of income, except the people at the very bottom line. So if you are single and you have $750,000 a year of taxable income or more, this is taxable after your deductions and credits, et cetera, or you're married filing jointly and you have $1 million, then you don't get any of those prior rate structures. All your taxable income is taxed at one flat rate of 7.99%. So you go from a flat rate of 4.95 to a flat rate of 7.99. Does it work? Yep. We've run the numbers, we vetted them. 97% of the state pays less. The state raises $3.6 billion, all from the wealthiest 3%. And our new rate structure doesn't make us look like Taxachusetts. Our top rate of 7.99 compares to some other Midwestern states' top rates. Look at Minnesota, 9.8, Iowa, 8.5, Wisconsin, 7.6. But look at where their income levels are for their top rates. Minnesota's top rate of 9.8 kicks in at $163,000 of taxable income. Our top rate kicks in at $1 million if you're married filing jointly, or $750 if you're single, way above that. So effectively, this new rate structure is relatively moderate compared to other rate structures that are out there. And in fact, it works. So the red bar shows tax burden as a percentage of income under current law. The blue bar shows you how it changes. And so all the tax increase comes from the wealthiest 3%. Minor tax cuts for everybody else. I do say minor because the state can't really afford to give away a lot of money in tax relief, so it didn't. But it did actually, but the truth is it cut it, just not by a lot. And note that the wealthiest folks in our state will still have a tax burden as a percentage of income that's lower than anybody else. This is hardly some kind of crazy eat the rich strategy, right? It's a rational piece of needed tax policy that we absolutely need to ratify as voters. So what else do we need to do? Okay, I'm not going to get into that. Sales tax base expansion. Will raising taxes kill our economy? No. Again, the peer-reviewed studies do not find statistically meaningful correlations between tax policy or job growth, et cetera, et cetera. One of my favorites was done by the Congressional Budget Office, by the way, and it cracked me up because we had to spend money on figuring this out. But they said, you know, federal state tax policy doesn't seem to matter. But they did find one thing that actually encourages businesses to hire more employees. Do you know what that was? I'm glad you're all seated. Take a deep breath. Apparently, when a business has growing demand for what it's selling, it will hire more employees to meet that demand. Who would have thought that? Really? Microeconomics apparently works. It's brilliant. But you know, flip side of that, how many times have you been told if we just cut business taxes, they will go out and create more jobs? It's such a silly thing to say, because if you cut their taxes, but there's no growing demand for whatever they're selling, and they're meeting demand with their current staff, why would they hire another person? That's inefficient excess capacity. That's wasteful. That cuts into your profitability. Don't do it, right? Look what happened with the Trump tax cuts. Look at all the others for business. We said all these jobs would come out of them, and they haven't, because businesses are rational actors. Now, are they going to fight for tax cuts every day of the week? Of course they are, because they are rational actors. They're trying to reduce their costs and grow their profits. They're not doing it to create new jobs. All right, and then we have a couple of great examples of tax changes recently from states around us, Kansas and Minnesota. Kansas got Governor Brown back a few years back, who said, you know, use Kansas as the test case. I mean, he said that, so we did. Said, we are going to cut taxes on the wealthy, supply side, right? And that'll free up so much of their income to trickle down. Do you really want to be trickled on, by the way? But to trickle down onto everyone else, that we'll have so many new jobs created, and that here's what will happen. Our economy in Kansas will grow faster than the rest of the Midwestern nation, and even though we cut taxes on really rich people, we won't have any revenue loss at the state level, because all these new jobs will have new taxpayers paying into the public coffers, and so the tax cuts will pay for themselves. Right? We've all heard this rhetoric. So what happened? They did, but it didn't. Literally none of the things they said would happen. So they didn't have a faster growing economy. In fact, they had a slower growing economy. They had huge deficits because of the revenue loss. They had to cut spending so significantly on K-12 education in Kansas that the Kansas Supreme Court ruled it violated their students' constitutional right to a quality education, forced the General Assembly to restore the cuts. So, bad. Then you had Governor Mark Dayton come into office in Minnesota, who inherited a hot mess. He walked into an accumulated deficit of $6.1 billion in a state with a population the size of Cook County. That's big. He had one of the highest unemployment rates in the country. He had a state economy that had only created 4,000 new jobs in the prior 7 years combined, not per year. And of course, he had bridges collapsing everywhere and whatever. So he said, look, we need a capital program. We need to invest better in schools. We've got to get rid of our deficit. We can't do any of these things without tax increase. So he increased taxes. He not only increased taxes, that new top tax rate on the wealthy that they installed in Minnesota of 9.85% is the third highest tax rate of any state in America. And so what happened after that? Well, 4 years later, they had 172,000 new jobs. Their unemployment rate was down to the lowest in the country, and they had a surplus. So you could just see that if you increase taxes on the wealthy, you're going to destroy your economy, right? No, there's never been data to support this, and we need to sort of kick it out of the water. But this is one of my favorite graphics on that. So 41 states in America actually have an income tax. That means 9 do not. And the 9 states that do not have an income tax are frequently called the miracle economic states of Texas and North Dakota and Nevada. You know, these places do it so great because they have natural resources or gaming, but so great, right? So this compares economic growth between those 9 states with no income tax at all and the 9 states in America that not only have income taxes but have the highest rates. So the high tax states are the dark color. It's supposed to be blue. It looks black. And the no tax states are the red color. This goes back 10 years. State GDP growth, significantly higher in the high tax states than the no tax states. Personal income growth, higher. Disposable income, higher. Personal consumption, higher. So you could just see these high tax rates on affluent peoples, they're killers, right? Look, tax policy has to be designed to work in a modern economy. Our state constitution prohibits us from using the income tax the way it has to be used, that is, as the one tax designed to comport with ability to pay. We have an opportunity now in Illinois to actually make that happen. And we have every fiscal reason in the world to do it, and really no reason not to. Every argument raised against this tax has been, you know, so much hot air. I'm going to go to one of my favorites, and then we'll end. Who has heard someone who's anti the Pritzker fair tax or whatever say, you know, if you go to a graduated rate structure, sure, now they're going to cut your taxes, but it just means they're going to raise taxes on the middle class down the road. This is all about raising taxes a bunch of times on the middle. Who's heard that? Anybody heard that? So Allison of our office did a quick look back. Allison, wave to nice people. There you go. Thank you, Allison. And we went back and looked at every state with a progressive tax structure. And since 2003, which is when we can get data to, there's been no change in 80% of them. 13% of them cut taxes. 5% of them did general tax increases that impacted everybody. And 2% of them did tax increases only on the wealthy. So based on what's actually happened in other states with progressive structures, your chances are more than twice as likely that you'll get a tax cut than a tax increase, based on what's actually happened, as opposed to the fear-mongering, which is really all the other side has. So we are done with fear-mongering in Illinois. We are done with arguments that aren't based on data or statistically meaningful correlations. It's time to just grow up on tax policy, ratify this fair tax, get a tax structure that sustainably funds some of our services, and move forward in Illinois for a change. And on that happy note, I'll be willing to take some questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Debt refinancing plan? Is it, you have proposed it and it was not passed?
Okay, so the pension refinancing plan. So yeah, we've had it put in legislatively every year for like the last 6 or 7 years, different legislative sponsors. We almost got it passed the last year of the Rauner administration. We had 15 Republicans on board behind the scenes with a bunch of Democrats, and then Rauner pulled the rug out from it at the last minute. So where it stands now is our sort of loudest champion on it is Will Davis, a state rep from the, where's his area? It's like it's just south of the city, right? Yeah, Homewood Flossmoor. He's been a real champion on it. And he and I have met with the governor and the governor's top budget people on this. And so we know the bill will go in again. We know there's going to be legislative hearings on it again. We think it should be tied to the fair tax, frankly, because the fair tax won't solve all problems, and there'll be some political issues. Wait a minute, you just got this fair tax, and now you're still saying you can't fund education adequately, right? So we really feel it's important for them to get some breathing space, real breathing space fiscally, and start solving things like, you heard Governor Pritzker, if you listen to his State of the State, say property taxes really have to come down. That can't happen unless we do at least both of these things and one or two other tax changes. I do tax policy for a living. How optimistic of a person do you think I am? Honestly. Honestly. I mean, I do drink, though. Yes, sir.
Are there any other possible reforms being talked about in the pension arena in Springfield that may rear their heads in the coming session?
Yeah, you know, there always are a number of pension reforms that get kicked down the road. Some folks every year, they tend to be on the more conservative side of the aisle, suggest that we should close our defined benefit plans altogether, move to a defined contribution system. That would be a nightmare. It would blow up our unfunded liability. It'd be far worse. Other folks are looking for a tier 3 or a tier 4 with lower benefits. Those things have been on the table, and you know that's been the traditional response that's come out of Springfield. Nothing that's come out of Springfield, though, has actually addressed the core problem, except for our proposal that goes. I mean, there's really only one way to skin this cat at this point. That backloaded repayment plan is so unreachable that the sooner we flatten that out, the better. But politically, it's a challenge. So
has there been any talk about any way of dealing with the COLA?
Well, you can't deal with the COLA for existing workers. And so, well, so here's the thing with that. If I could go back and show you the numbers, the COLA is not a problem anymore at all. Come on. Up. See. This is the normal cost for current workers, including the COLA that they're getting. That's the cost of funding current workers' benefits. This is paying back what was borrowed. So you could create a new tier 4 or 5 that does a worse COLA than what they have now. You'll take down this pink bar a little bit in the future for new hires that come on under that system, right? You won't touch the debt service. It's the debt service that's killing us. And so that's why we have focused all of our efforts on the debt service, not on those other elements. And in fact, tier 1, Giselle, do you remember off the top of your head what percentage of the workforce is still tier 1? Yeah, so tier 1, which has that 3% compounding COLA you hear about, is 15–20% of the workforce now, and diminishing, right, because it's old. Tier 2 doesn't have anywhere near that kind. So we've already gotten rid of what people complained about as the overly generous COLA. But historical context, so COLA stands for cost of living adjustment. Back when that was passed, it was viewed as a win for management because inflation rates were 7–8%. And so they got a cost of living adjustment agreed to by their workforce, capped at 3% per year, which everyone thought was a great deal. But economies change. And after a while, when inflation rates dip down below 2%, they're saying, what are we doing? And this is compounding annually. But that's more of a recent development. Actually, when it passed, it was viewed as a win for management. So go figure.
Okay, so one of the first things Pritzker did was put a tax on, one of the first things Pritzker did when he took office was put a tax on fuel with the promise that the tax would go directly to infrastructure. As we know, as history shows us, that rarely happens. So my question is, how can we make sure that he's keeping that promise?
Well, there's a lockbox now for revenues raised from the gas tax and stuff for transportation. So this was a constitutional amendment that passed 4 years ago. So now they have far less discretion to move. They used to do that game all the time. So you're exactly right to raise it. It's something they just, hey, fun, we play with numbers. But they really can't anymore because of this lockbox thing for transportation. So that, at least, abuse was done away with.
When was the flat tax rate put into the Constitution?
1970, with the birth of the Constitution, and it was a political compromise, like all things are. But at that time, some conservative downstate Democrats and Republicans were anxious about creating the first ever income tax for the state of Illinois. So while it was initially a permissive clause that would have allowed a graduated rate structure, they said, we will only support, we've decided if it's flat rate. So to get it, they made a political compromise.
You've made a convincing case for the benefit of the fair tax.
You are a great American.
Thank you. But there's a but that comes after that, which is that we're in Illinois. And so I think a lot of people in here are saying, great, so they're going to do that, but then are they actually going to turn around and apply that towards solving the debt service problem? Because we've got lots of other revenue sources that have just been tapped into in the state, like legalizing pot and gambling and other things, and none of them, as far as I know, and I'm a layperson, are being directed to solve some of these structural issues. So I think we've got a serious confidence problem, and that's going to interfere with our ability to get that amendment passed.
Far be it for me to be the person to tell you to trust Springfield, okay? Because, right, I have eyes and ears too. However, here's why I trust them on fiscal policy right now. And actually, it's interesting you raised the cannabis. Cannabis funds, some of them are specifically earmarked for debt reduction. They have an earmark built in. So their fiscal condition is so bad right now that I have every confidence they will work down the debt. And the reason I have that confidence is the temporary tax increase that passed in 2011. I don't know if you remember that, but the rate was temporarily 5%. When that passed, our accumulated state deficit was approaching $17 billion. 4 years that was in place, they paid it down to 5. And then Governor Rauner came in, and we had no budget for 2 years, and he let the temporary tax expire. So it started ballooning up again to 9 and 10. And then they took out a one-time loan of $6 billion to pay some PAC due bills, got some Medicaid match, blah, 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 some magic in the budget. And they've paid it down now to 7.5 again. I am convinced they will get it down. They'll always carry a deficit. Every state, I don't care who they are, they carry a little bit of a deficit from one year to the next. But carrying a deficit in a state like Illinois of around $2 billion is rational, and they will get there. My other confidence is, you know, they've spent 97 cents out of every dollar on education, health, social services, and public safety. So the direct expenditures are going to a good place. And the only thing that's stopping them from making adequate investments in any of those areas is this debt. So they do want to be rid of that debt so that they could go back to their communities and say, look what I'm doing for our schools, and look what I'm doing for healthcare, and blah, blah, blah. So the numbers here really reinforce the fact that the right thing will be done with the lion's share of the money. And I'm not going to say that they won't do the right thing with every penny of the money, because that never happens in any system, and certainly not one run by top politicians, but the vast majority of it will be.
Time for one more question.
I was just wondering, by comparison, how does Florida rank with their income tax? And
Florida doesn't have an income tax.
Pardon?
Florida does not have an income tax.
Can I just ask a quick question? You know, I've never left town, and I remember when the big deal about Illinois tolls were going to education, the toll.
No, it wasn't the tolls, it was the lottery.
Oh, okay. I thought they also said the toll.
No, toll money has always gone for roads and in a segregated, and well, if you want to do an analysis of IDOT, the Illinois Department of Transportation, that would be entertaining, and I'm sure we'd uncover many a skeleton buried by Democratic and Republican administrations. However, the lottery is a good thing to raise, because that's another one of the, to your question, that people are cynical about, right? So when we got the lottery, it was sold as something that would fund education. And here's the good news, bad news. The good news is it always funded education. That's what they did with 98% of the proceeds, and I think 2% went to breast cancer research. But 98% always went to the Common School Fund. But for every penny that went into the Common School Fund from the lottery, a penny that used to go in from sales or income tax came out. So it became substitution revenue rather than enhancement revenue, because why? The state had a structural deficit. So they said, great, we got $500 million more for schools from the lottery. That frees up $500 million from other sources to fund, you know, healthcare and social services. So that's exactly what they did because of their bad fiscal condition. That actually changed a couple of years ago too. So I think 5 or 6 years ago, they passed a law that all lottery revenue growth from its base had to be in addition to the prior year's funding. So now it's actually tiny, but it's accretive, so it's adding on. Okay, thank you.